Or a Sharpie?
I always have a Sharpie.
Yeah.
You know me, never gonna go very far without a Sharpie, but there's a.
How many of those did bring to Minnesota Power on it?
I got way too
No,
many.
that's the wrong color. I like to.
It's really bad.
Okay.
I don't know why I use this front pouch for that, but I just,
Well.
anytime my wife would.
What's Fire Prices doing now?
Pouring?
Yeah.
Okay, you can go ahead and call me later. 7.
I call to order the June 2022 meeting of the Governance and Policy Committee. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to those who are here live and those who are joining us via live stream video. Our first item of business, that is our annual review of Board of Regents policy, code of conduct for members of the Board of Regents. This annual review is required by the policy, and I invite Deputy Director and Associate Secretary Dirksen and General Counsel Peterson to take us through the review. So Deputy Director Dirksen, would you like to start? Mouthful, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. Later in the agenda today, you'll hear the annual board policy report. And while most of the board's policies are intended to set parameters for the entire university, this code of conduct policy is one of those that focuses solely on regents and the operations of the board. This policy articulates the responsibilities of being a regent and sets forth some guardrails for how you operate as a governing board. You last comprehensively reviewed this and significantly amended it in February of 2020. This policy also requires, as the chair mentioned, that it be reviewed with the board annually, which is why it's before you today. So General Counsel Peterson is going to walk through some of the policy highlights and stand for any questions you might have. So with that, General Counsel.
Thank you, Chair Verhalen. Good morning. You have the privilege of waking up to talking about your code of conduct. So if you don't mind, I'll talk a bit about sort of the structure of the code, because it turns on really 2 sections, the guiding principles and the 3 fiduciary duties. And I'd like to talk about those things from a couple different perspectives, and I'm going to foreshadow for you that I'm going to overstep my bounds on the second perspective. First off, I want to kind of work through some of the requirements of the law and the policy as we do year to year. But I also want to offer you a second perspective, and it's really one of how these rules form the building blocks of what I would characterize as a well-working board, and how these principles are really the guides for what I would characterize as good governance. The code does center on section 2, which are those guiding principles, and I'm going to highlight 2 principles for you here to start. The first one is the constitutional principle of autonomy. The 12 of you are the university. I mean, we saw it in that mortgage yesterday. It's regents of the University of Minnesota. When the university is sued in a lawsuit, the defendant is not the University of Minnesota, it's the regents of the University of Minnesota. And that's all by design, because the founders contemplated that all of you would be in charge of the multi-dimensional mission of the university. And you'd have sort of within your purview all the pieces of the puzzle. And that means executive, legislative, and judicial. And that's a very unique position in government. You perform executive functions in terms of, analyzing the budget and delegating authority, but at the same time, you have a legislative approach in terms of oversight of sort of the University of Minnesota and how it's conducting its affairs. And you also have a judicial role, largely through kind of what you delegate, but it's significant that in employment matters, unlike with any other institution in Minnesota, once you make an employment decision, that goes immediately to the Court of Appeals. You, in a lot of ways, are sort of the district court in the employment realm, and that's unique. And so that sort of sense of your autonomy over the affairs of the University of Minnesota means certainly on one hand, the buck stops with you, but maybe a better way to put it is that the privilege of the opportunity is entrusted to you. I think that's maybe a better way to look at these fiduciary duties. The second principle that's reflected in that section are the quote, highest ethical standards, unquote, that all of you are to uphold. And what's significant about that to me, and maybe leads to that second perspective, is that that's talk of ethics as opposed to rules. And so as a lawyer, when I start hearing ethics, what comes from that are concepts like judgment, civility, professionalism, proportionality. All of those are concepts of aspirations and values rather than a textbook of regulations. I'm going to have that sort of flavor here as we talk through the three fiduciary duties, because those are care, loyalty, and obedience. When I run through that from the rules perspective, and you've heard me talk about these three fiduciary duties before, duty of care, go about your work in good faith, do your homework. That means relying on experts, internal and external. Yet at the same time, in the end, you need to exercise your judgment and your common sense after taking in that information. Loyalty, be free of conflicts of interest. Those are actual conflicts of interest and perceived conflicts, or the appearance of conflict of interest. And, that can arise because of financial conflicts with you or your family in the university, or it could arise because of employment-related conflicts. And you see that kind of work itself through the code of conduct. It also means you need to be free of undue influence. So you need to avoid any significant gifts of any significant amount. And those are gifts to you as a regent, but also gifts from you to government officials or to their staff. And then the third fiduciary duty of obedience, that's a term that's not used typically in for-profit corporations. And the reason is that typically with nonprofit boards or a board like this, you don't have a share stake in the corporation in a financial sense. And so what constrains you, or what is sort of the mission that you have, is to be consistent or maintain your fidelity to the research, teaching, and service mission of the University of Minnesota, and do so in a way that holds you publicly accountable to the large responsibilities you have on behalf of the state of Minnesota. Now the aspirational part of those three fiduciary duties, if you'd allow me. To me, when I hear those words, care, loyalty, and obedience, you start thinking about what are the values that underpin those fiduciary concepts. And those are judgment words rather than rules words. And living out those values as board members, to me, is really an issue of what culture you create for yourselves as a board, but also what culture you model for the University of Minnesota. And when I try to kind of sum all that up in a word, I mean, the word that comes to me, and I'm sure there are others that are applicable, is collegiality. And when I use the term collegiality, I don't mean agreement. In fact, I think these fiduciary duties have the most life when all of you strongly disagree with each other over a particular issue. And so the more collegial you are in terms of how you go about working through those disagreements, to me, is the more you sort of work well as a board. The more collegial you are, the better you're able to balance this executive, legislative, and judicial role. and try to figure out when you should be in an oversight mode, or otherwise when you should be working hand in hand with administration, with the notion that the good ideas you have in order to be effective need to be implemented by administration. And so there needs to be sort of that trusting working relationship. And sometimes you need to, follow the lead of your delegees. And other times, it's time for you to exercise your authority. And that's a difficult balance, but you sort of know it when you see it. Collegiality also kind of picks up the notion of shared governance, which is so important in a university, because that collegiality term, as I say, reaches beyond just your board itself. I'll offer to you this morning that I actually think that all of you work your best when you are dealing with complicated issues with complex solutions. And I feel like that's when all of you work sort of on all cylinders, and good things come from that. And it kind of makes sense that significant problems, are going to require coordination between board, administration, faculty, students, the community, larger university community, and sort of the public. I mean, you need that buy-in in order to advance the mission of the University of Minnesota. And maybe another way to put this is that when all of you are sort of living the aspirational values behind these fiduciary duties, I tell you that you inspire the university when you're in that mode. And you make everybody in the state proud to be connected with the University of Minnesota when you are sort of highly functioning and living out sort of these fiduciary duties. And I'll tell you that I sort of come at this with a fair amount of humility. I know I live in a glass house and don't always kind of accomplish the, what I would hope to aspire to kind of day to day. But I also know it's easy to recover. And I also think it's easy for this board to recover. And the reason for that, and the reason why everybody quickly comes back to task, is because of the faith and devotion that everybody has for the University of Minnesota. It's a glue that allows people to gel back together and to understand that when people care a lot about this university, there are going to be tough arguments and there are going to be divisions within a board. I mean, that's natural. And I think the challenge is to kind of work through those in this collegial fashion, and also have an eye to sort of how to recover and make sure that the spirit of a University of Minnesota as a whole comes back, which again kind of circles back to that guiding principle that speaks of kind of looking out for the interests of the university as a whole. To wrap up here, I do want to highlight 3 particular sections and do that relatively quickly. The first is section 8. It's the one that talks in some detail about conflicts of interest. And it gets back to that principle, quote, highest ethical standards, unquote. And so the most important message about conflicts of interest for me is the same message that I certainly give the lawyers in OGC and, have talked to lawyers about throughout the course of my career, which is when something comes up that gives you that spider sense that you may be kind of walking into a touchy area or a conflict question, talk with somebody about it. I mean, that's really the most important remedy, because whether you're talking to me or you're talking to board staff, you're raising the issue with the board chair, usually in a conflict realm, solutions kind of spill out of those conversations. And the sooner you talk about it, the easier it is to develop a remedy. And, while the word conflict of interest, has, a lot of concern swirling around it, oftentimes the solution can involve, public transparency or disclosure. It can involve a tailored recusal. There are a lot of tools we have to try to address a conflict of interest in a responsible fashion. So please, raise those questions. And I know all of you have been just superb about doing that. So I'm most appreciative as general counsel in the way that you will go about talking those things through. Section 5 is another key disclosure step. It is the section that talks about your filing annual financial disclosure statements, which are really the basis to help evaluate potential conflicts of interest. And I will say for the record that I reviewed all 12 of your annual financial disclosure statements, and all of them are in compliance with the Code of Conduct. Finally, Section 9, it's where the 3 fiduciary duties, care, loyalty, and obedience, settle in on the topic of communications outside of meetings. And I appreciate that has some sensitivity to it. The rule talks in terms of the president being the primary spokesperson for the University of Minnesota, board leadership speaking on behalf of the board after you act, or speaking for the university when necessary. And then as to individual regents, I think the best way for me to address that is to simply quote from that particular section. As fiduciaries, regents should be aware that the timing, tone, and substance of their words reflect on the university and could have legal or other consequences. When sharing their individual views on university matters, regents shall clarify that they are not speaking for the board. End of quotation and end of presentation this morning. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson, General Counsel Peterson. Are there any questions or comments from the regents? Regent Powell.
Chair Verheugen, thank you. Just a quick one, General Counsel, in regard to political contributions. And so I was on the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Board for 6 years and then term limited off. And the rule that we had there, is completely nonpartisan board. And I think that this rule applies to all 12 districts across the country. We're, of course, allowed to make political contributions because that's free expression, but we were not allowed to, I don't know, you may know what it was better than I, but to campaign. For example, we weren't allowed to sponsor an event for a candidate because that was felt to go beyond, this nonpartisan bubble. And I'm wondering if that distinction, is that you may not know the answer, but is that a unique distinction, or is that apply to other kinds of institutions? If you're not familiar with it, we can come back to it another time, but they were quite forceful, with that board that was not allowed.
Chair Verheugen and Regent Powell, that would require homework on my part. Certainly, with a Federal Reserve position, you're governed by the Hatch Act and much more stringent standards than would apply to regents of the University of Minnesota. So in your private citizen capacity, you certainly have the ability to contribute to campaigns and to participate in electioneering. And I think the question you raised just is an issue of, at any point, does hosting an event kind of slip into a gift to a government official? My instinct tells me that that's going to fall more in the free speech side of the house, because you're really doing that in that official's capacity of running for office as opposed to exercising their authority as a public official. But that's a complicated subject. And as I say, I'd want to do homework before I braved an answer to that.
It's not anything I need to press today. I really was just looking for any thoughts you had. We can take it up offline. Thank you.
Regent Rosha.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Since we have you here, General Counsel, and this is very interesting stuff to folks who deal with this kind of language in other ways. A question that I've had over time is, especially when it relates to the membership of the board and conflict of interest and the board's relationship in processes here. If you go to subdivision 4, part of section, looks like 8, and it states that if a conflict exists coming through this process, either the board shall approve a plan for addressing a conflict or the regent shall resign from the board. Now, any number of conflicts that may arise that would, potentially require some sort of a plan. If there's disagreement, what's the authority of this board to compel a member of this board to resign? To what extent can this board, which is created by the Constitution, create rules that would modify or impact the application of the Constitution?
Regent Rosha and Regent Verhalen, complicated topic. We have done a fair amount of research on that topic and in other contexts. It's been a while, so I don't remember all of the particulars, but what it touches on is, it's again, the uniqueness of being a regent. I mean, you are a regent because of an act of the legislature. And so to what extent can this board kind of regulate itself, so to speak? To what extent does the legislative appointment intersect with, the ability of a board to govern itself? And, our general conclusion is that the concept of constitutional autonomy takes over in terms of this board's ability to self-regulate. But at the same time, there are a number of kind of dimensions and angles to that argument that's it would be a novel question under Minnesota law in terms of how the legislative power to appoint intersects with the constitutional autonomy of the board to regulate the university and thus regulate itself.
Any follow-up?
Thank you, Madam Chair. The challenge, of course, is that as you move into the subjective, which much of this is, when you look at the broad, if you take the broadest reading of the language of a conflict, a potential personal interest, I have a 13-year-old child who may come here one day, so I would have a potential financial interest in certain decisions that this board makes, and that would be a very, very broad reading of that language. But if you went broad enough, the concern about when you say regulate itself as opposed to determine its membership, I mean, I think that that's a very narrow component of regulating itself. That it would be interesting, as you say, it is a novel question. I believe in state law, but our capacity to override the legislature and form our, ultimately you could get 7 members that could control the full membership of the board under that reading. So I'd be surprised if it was that broad, but I am, appreciative of the answer, and obviously anything that you would add after this meeting, I'd be interested in understanding that. Thank you.
Yeah, if I might, Chair Verhalen, Regent Rosha, just to follow up, a little bit, it's undoubtedly an area where facts matter. I mean, oftentimes, people can wrestle with hypothetical legal concepts, but in the end, facts matter. And so if it's helpful to you, take it a step down from something where people are speaking in terms of resignation of a board member. Take it to the issue of recusal. I tell you that as I go about thinking through conflict questions for you as regents, I'm very conscious of the fact that recusal means that one of the 12 members of this board who's been appointed by the legislature would not be voting or weighing in on a matter of importance to the University of Minnesota. So recusal isn't something that, I take lightly in terms of recommending as a remedy. I mean, oftentimes all of you do that in the normal course. It's the respectful thing to do. It's something that isn't going to have a material impact on the result of the particular issue. But at the same time, as you know, all of us think through sort of the remedy side of conflicts, I'm very cognizant of the fact that this is not just another corporate board where recusal may be more commonplace. I think recusal is a political step, if you will, of having you be a regent group of 11 rather than a regent group of 12. And the Constitution calls for a group of 12. So all of these kind of remedies kind of touch on ultimately some sensitive, important topics, that tension that I talked about earlier between legislative appointment and constitutional autonomy once appointed.
Thank you.
Regent McMillan.
Thanks, Chair Verhalen. And thank you, General Counsel Peterson, for this out of bed, wake up, walkthrough of ethics and things. We spend a fair amount of time applying a myriad of state laws to our processes, procedures, these policies, and Regent Roshan, you just had a discussion about a constitutional element there. And it feels like a good time to remind myself and maybe my colleagues about another law that intersects here, and just the talk about gifts got me thinking about it. I believe it's an exception to the Ethics in Government Act for higher education, public higher ed, and probably public K-12 in the state that allows the university and us individually to give legislators athletic tickets. But there's also a de minimis exception, and I've never run to ground that because I'm told it's fine to do it. But can you make sure we're not, we all understand how that works? Am I thinking of that law correctly?
You are, and part of that kind of relates to the fact that we are talking, let's say, Huntington Bank Stadium. I mean, that's a public facility that the legislature certainly has a stake in terms of how it was funded and grounded. And so it's back to service mission of the University of Minnesota, and everybody has a twinkle in their eye when they talk of it in terms of University of Minnesota athletics, but it is another program activity here at the university. And I think that's maybe a policy explanation for why, invitations to legislators and other public officials to the Regent Suite, for example, is permitted.
Any follow-up? Regent Swigum?
Madam Chair, thank you. Real quickly, Council Peterson, because you are here and we can ask you directly. In response to Chair Powell, you mentioned electioneering, was the word you used, electioneering. That is certainly not prohibited. I assume that includes things like door knocking for partisan candidates, parades, things like that you have the right to be able to do.
Regent Swigum, the answer is yes. But I think it also gets back to the fact you have to be careful to make sure you're doing that as Steve Sviggum rather than as Regent Sviggum. And I think if you are knocking on the door and sort of speaking and mouthing the fact that you're a regent of the University of Minnesota, and as a result, that's why you would prefer to endorse a particular candidate. That's a different message than if you are simply concerned citizen Steve Sviggum, who's advocating with your private citizen free speech hat on for an elected official. And I think that really kind of plays out more when people are picking up endorsements, and how is the endorsement listed by the candidate, and is it listed as Regent Steve Sviggum, or is it listed as Steve Sviggum?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll make sure not to wear my University of Minnesota shirt. So
At least not your regent of the University of Minnesota.
Not the Regent seal. Well, with that, thank you so much, General Counsel Peterson. Appreciate the time and the effort you put in on this. Thank you.
Thanks for the time.
Our next item is an overview of the 2022 Board Policy Report. This report is also required by Board Policy. Here to provide a summary of the report is Jason Langworthy, Policy Manager and Assistant Secretary. Mr. Langworthy, please proceed.
Chair Verhalen, members of the committee, good morning. We're just going to keep the hit parade rolling here from Code of Ethics to policy. So, great, that was the reaction I was looking for. So,
We all silently cheered.
Thank
It's
you,
okay.
thank you. Appreciate it. We can go to the next slide. So a year ago, you'll recall that myself and my administrative colleague, Michelle Gross, presented to you an overview of the university policy framework. So I'm just going to do a quick reframing of that, and then I'll talk about the work of the board policy report lays out here in some detail. So first, just to ground us in policy, the key one that we're talking about is Board of Regents policy, board policy development. That sets up the structure for how board policy works and requires a comprehensive review of all board policies every 6 years. This is the policy review cycle. We talked about this more in depth last year, but this is just to remind you that there is a multiple step process that each board policy goes through before it arrives here for your consideration. In terms of types of review, we have the comprehensive review, and so that determines, and it's really asking policy implementers to think about whether the policy content aligns with the strategic direction and mission of the university, especially now with MPAC 2025, whether the policy aligns with current practice, and if the policy is still needed. It may or may not result in changes to the policy. You'll see that reported later. If we're reviewing regularly, and since board policies are often setting broad guiding principles, it doesn't necessarily mean that a comprehensive review will result in changes. At the same time, though, it very well might, as it did with the student conduct code that was before you yesterday. And that, again, is every 6 years. You codified the comprehensive review into board policy development in 2017. So we just completed our first cycle of getting through board policies. Not everything is finished, as you'll see, but we've at least completed that first cycle since we break up our 88 board policies into classes of about 13 to 15 each year. So we've just completed that first full cycle. The other two types of review are off-cycle changes. So these focus on specific, essential, time-sensitive changes. They can be across an entire policy. They might be one section of a policy. It's outside of the comprehensive review cycle, so we continue to make sure that each board policy has that comprehensive review because that has a different focus. But if there's something that needs to be changed, for example, the chief auditor amendments are a great example of that. We had an opportunity. Those were off-cycle changes. They were around a specific topic that the board made. And then technical change, minor corrections that don't alter the substance of the policy. If we have a change in a title or the way something is referred to or a typo appears in board policy, we can make technical changes with the approval of the board chair. So the 2022 board policy report is required by board policy development. And there are three main objectives for the report. First, we report the results of policy work completed during the current fiscal year. And so for 21-22, you'll see this in your docket. We have 10 board policies that completed comp review with no revisions recommended. We amended 16. That's a little inflated this year. Simply because of the work that the board did around the required reports and the chief auditor. That encompassed a wide variety of reports, but was very narrow in its scope. We have two pending for your consideration, the student conduct code that you'll likely act on later today, and then the amendments to the debt transactions policy that were reviewed yesterday in finance and operations. We have 4 with amendments in process, and then 10 that are still under review. And I'll talk a little bit more about some examples here in a second. The second part of this report outlines the policy work plan for the next fiscal year. So that starts on July 1 for the 22-23, and includes policies up for comp review, those held over from a previous year, and any that might require off-cycle changes. For this coming year, we have 13 board policies up for comp review. We'll carry 10 forward with us, along with those 4 in process and the 2 pending. And finally, we would certainly like you to review the report, and throughout the year, if there are policies, board policies there that you have questions on, that there are items that you're interested in, wondering about, please let us know in the board office so we can share that with the policy implementers as they're performing their comprehensive review. So just a few quick examples from the report. So as I mentioned, one finding is comprehensively reviewed, no revisions recommended. So we had 2 of those this year. 2 examples here, the board policy development, since that was significantly rewritten in 2017. It seems to be working well so far. And then college constitutions, the provost office reviewed that, and that was reported to you at Mission Fulfillment, felt that no changes were needed at this time. Amended by the Board of Regents, I mentioned the board required reports. That was a large undertaking by this committee, and that resulted in numerous amendments across board policies using that resolution format that then was one action, but it had lots of amendments across those policies to get that into alignment with the recommendations. Property and facility use was an off-cycle change, specific to bring those guiding principles for property into the policy that finance and operations started with in the fall and then took up and you adopted in February. So that was an off-cycle change, an area where the administration felt this would be something that we would like to have, and we would prefer not to wait for the next comprehensive review. We would like to address this currently. So those pending action, as I mentioned, the student conduct code. So that certainly will come up in a committee report later today. And then for the final 2, the drafting of amendments in progress. This is a new category this year. We're wanting to show you that there are policies where the implementer has said, yes, we need to draft amendments. We want to do that. They just weren't quite ready by the time we ended this fiscal year. So those will be held over. The 2 examples there, the code of conduct and the commercialization of intellectual property rights, both of those were up for comprehensive review. There's a lots of consultation that is going on with both of those. With the code of conduct, for example, there's a task force that's thinking about faculty misconduct. And so sort of waiting for other work that's being done in consultation as those amendments are being drafted. Finally, there are certainly times when board policies come up for review and they're just not completed in terms of, are amendments needed or not. So one example, and you'll see this in the report, 5 of the 10 that we're holding over are private practice plans that are implemented over in the academic health center. And certainly they've had 1 or 2 things on their plate the last few years. So in that situation, just in terms of bandwidth and needing to talk and consult, those will continue forward into next year. The same with the student services fee and the tuition and fees. Those 2 policies were up for comp review in 2 different years. It felt like the right approach to align those. And especially since the student services fee is implemented by student affairs, they had a heavy lift this year with the student conduct code. So those 2 are advancing forward and will be reviewed. And we'll anticipate some results next fiscal year. Much sort of like what you hear in the Audit and Compliance Committee when the internal audit, as long as we're making progress towards completing those reviews, then we're in good shape. But sometimes certainly the policy implementer offices have a number of things on their plate. So if it needs to take a little bit more time to do the consultation necessary, that's completely fine. And we'll just hold those over into the next year. So with that, Chair Verheugen, happy to stand for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Langworthy. Any questions from the Regent Rosha?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Not really a question so much as a congratulations, thank you, with just a little bit of history, if we've just got a couple minutes. This is an amazing process. And the current policy compilation and process is exceptional, and I could not have imagined it being at this level when first joining the board in '89, when I was first elected. We had some matters that came before the board, and there was a policy provided to us from, I think, something in the 60s as the region's policy on a matter, but there was also one from 1944 that said exactly the opposite, in different cultural, different political times. And I posed the question, well, if I wanted to see what the region's policies are as a sort of body, where would I find them? And it did not exist. And so much to Chair Chuck Casey's credit, who Chuck was at the event last evening, he appointed a committee of Regent Alan Page, myself, and Vice Chair Cooterer to go through what they could compile as all of the region's policies that had ever been passed and not specifically rescinded. And it was a stack about everything was in paper. It was from filing cabinets all over the campus, and it was a couple feet high. And we literally went through every single policy. We put the policies that were the same on the same topic together, and ultimately we had a lot of things that were enabling actions, like we voted to pay a couple $100,000, or back then maybe $10,000 for a machine for mowing Memorial Stadium or something like that. And so we actually broke down what was policy, what was administrative, and then the entire board received all of this material and had to ultimately go through and vote for what was a 3-ring binder. That was the first policy compilation, the policy manual of the board. And so, after leaving the board and coming back after 20 years, I was amazed at how far that had developed. And even in the time that I've been back on the board, watching Mr. Langworthy in particular, along with the leadership of the board office, continue to improve this and create this process for not just having it and compiling it, but getting the input from the proper enterprises around the university to have a policy manual of this level. I think I don't know of anything better. I've looked at other institutions, what they have, what access that they have, and for the public to have access to this so conveniently, it really is exceptional. So thank you. I really appreciate it, and I think it helps this board move so much more quickly than if we had to take that step back to find and understand what policies were before we move forward. So I appreciate it.
Any response, Mr. Okay. Anyone else? Well, the lack of comments and questions is certainly not out of a lack of interest, because this is really important, and we've over this year through governance and policy definitely spent a lot of time on these, and no staff has as well. So thank you, and you just couldn't help yourself, could you?
I could not.
Regent McMillan?
Thank you, Chair Verhalen. I thought, given that we have Mr. Langworthy in this setting, and I certainly echo Regent Rocha's appreciation for the complexity and the comprehensiveness and the quality of what you do and your colleagues here in the board office. It's amazing and probably best in class. But let me ask you and see if how you feel. Policies either come through this review process, that's one way. They come from the administration, that's another, and you just outline these. Yesterday, we had one that really, I don't know how you even, if we didn't do the 30-year, 500 million, that would never have come. So it's like its own category of things. And I guess my question is this, Mr. Langworthy, how robust is the review process, and how comfortable is the Office of the Board of Regents with the administration in making sure that when they aren't part of the big review cycle, you're getting engaged? I don't mean you personally, somebody, one of your colleagues, or the right people. I mean, it sounded like you were very complimentary to your counterpart in the administration for the review cycle reviews, that's you feel good about the robustness there. Do you feel as good about the off cycle and the unexpecteds?
Chair Verhalen.
Please.
Regent McMillan, yes, we have really great partners in the administration. So each policy implementer, and when I refer to a policy implementer, that's a senior leader that has responsibility over a function within the institution, right? So for example, yesterday, the debt transactions. That policy is implemented by Senior Vice President Myron Franz. And so in each of those offices, I work with a liaison, either the senior leader or one of their key individuals, and build those relationships, both because I'm reaching out to them about that comp review every year and bugging them about those policies, and then also through those relationships, and because the institution understands that these are our Board of Regents policies, right, that they ultimately come to the board. They are great partners in letting us know we're thinking about this, what about this, and often engage us early and in the board office, and then we can talk through and help to provide some guidance. Ultimately, it's the president's recommendation unless it's a policy that's implemented by the board. So they have to take responsibility for the language that's there. But I've never had a time when we've offered a suggestion that we've been sort of, maybe some, well, what if we did this or that? But they're always interested in our feedback. And I think it's a good partnership across the board.
Regent McMillan, any follow-up?
None.
Okay.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Anything further? All right. There being no further business before this committee, we are adjourned, and the full board will convene for its annual meeting in 15 minutes, so 9:06.
9:05.
Oh, you were getting 14 minutes.